There we
All
go.
right, so
Hopefully that does it.
great.
All right.
Sorry about that. Okay, thank you for whoever called in there to fix our technical glitches. So
Sorry, everybody. I see you, and we have the information now. Thank you.
So I don't know how, I just read a little allegorical story and I don't know how well that came through, but I promise you, if people could send some chat comments to Professor Wrights and let us know, and I can repeat that at the end.
They did not get any of it, but if you want to read that last two sentences, I think that might be
great.
I think that would be the,
Great. I think if I go fast enough, we'll have time, and we'll kind of we'll ask this question at the very end of the presentation. So sorry about that. Okay. And which I'm pointing technology of
right now.
great. And where am I pointing?
Right here.
Okay, great. So I'll tell everybody there's no computer invented in the world that I can't break in about 3 minutes. So here's the picture of Benjamin Franklin flying his kite. He gets struck by electricity, and out is born a new, our American democracy. And that's the story of America, isn't it? Well, of course, that's not true. It's a little bit more complicated. Here's what we're going to be covering in very short order. I've got a lot of, we're going to turn our PowerPoint into a motion picture. That's how quickly we're going to go through these slides. But here are some of the big concepts we're going to touch on. We're going to look at democracy right now in 2021 and some of the problems that we are experiencing. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about history. I absolutely love history. I'm a lifelong learner of history, but history can give us a superpower. It can give us a power to understand what is occurring in our world right now, and it can give us the foresight to predict what's going to happen in the future. And I'm going to give you 2 history books, and I'm going to tie those lessons to help us in our understanding of the US Constitution. And then finally, we're going to jump in and answer this question: what exactly is the US Constitution? How did it come about? Why do people fight and are so passionate about this? And what does that mean for saving democracy? So a lot to cover. Most of us are very patriotic. This is our view. This is what we like to think of. We're all patriotic. And this is our vision of America in an idealistic way. But this is America right now in 2021. I used to talk about the rule of law and that we would have peaceful elections and we didn't have to send tanks into Washington, D.C. for a change of government. We didn't have to send in the military. We operate under the rule of law by law, not by military force. I didn't think I'd ever have to see a day like January 6th. And these images, by the way, some of these defendants now, their defense in court is stupidity. They're saying we didn't really know and we were fooled by the propaganda and we're not the highest IQ people. That's their defense. For real. If you get a speeding ticket and you're going 100 miles an hour down the highway and you say, I didn't know, are you going to get out of that speeding ticket? No. Stupidity is not a defense for a speeding ticket. Stupidity is not a defense for treason. We are in an incredibly polarized country. We're fighting over things. We have blue states and red states and conservatives and liberals and Democrats and Republicans. And it seems like everything is at a fever pitch fight. Something as the should be controversial, such as masks in schools, is a controversial issue. My wife and I have a 12-year-old, and that's the raging debate in the school district that we're in. The saddest part of this one, I think, is this little picture of the father with his daughter and trying to, most of us adopt the political viewpoint of our own parents. They shape our own political ideology. And I'm sure that's not what's going through this father's head, but myself as a lawyer, this is how I interpret his thoughts. I'm okay if my child dies because I think it's more important to fight for the right to freedom. Of course, that's not what any father would say. And maybe he doesn't understand that that's what he's teaching this daughter. But we are inculcating our children with hate and ignorance. We're going to start with history. Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. De Tocqueville came to America, studied America, wrote the seminal book and traveling through. What was the glue that made America work? Here's a picture of Herodotus, the Greek, the founder of our history. I like this quote from Teddy Roosevelt: "The more you know about the past, the better you are prepared for the future." This picture of the soothsayer looking into a crystal ball. Each of us has this special power of foresight if we can look at the history of the past. Let me see if I can explain what I mean by that. The study of history is the beginning of wisdom. So here's a book that I read several years ago by David Fromkin. It's called The Peace to End All Peace. Just that title alone is a great title, isn't it? The Peace to End All Peace. And this is a very terrible story at the end of during World War I. The European powers still had this kind of imperial mentality, and they drew up a secret pact to carve up the Middle East and which country, France or England or others, would have a sphere of influence in the Middle East after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. There's the Treaty of Versailles and Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson went through Europe, and he went through Paris and he went through London, and he was praised as the greatest man in the world for his concept of peace and the League of Nations. But what he did not bring with him were any of the Republican senators on the boat trip over there. And when he returned to get that treaty passed, he could not do so. But there was a military pamphlet from the early part of our century that talked about the politics in the Middle East. And it said, you have to understand there's a deep religious faction. And within the Muslim world, there are Shiites and there are Sunnis. People have a tribal identity, they have a clan identity, and they have factions. And it's a very difficult mess. That is the mentality of this part of the world. And the best thing is to not go there. So that is the lesson that our US military had deduced at the turn of the last century. Here's a picture, and they just created arbitrary lines and created these new countries called Iraq and Iran and Syria and Jordan without any rhyme or reason or not any understanding of where the different tribal and clan groups were aligned. They just drew arbitrary countries. Here's pictures of Afghanistan, and the point that should be obvious is, do any of these people, have they gone to school and said, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of Afghanistan and to the Republic? They don't have any idea of a country with geographic boundaries and a patriotic view that this is my country. Instead, their allegiance is based on family, based on clan and tribe, and based on religious sects. It's not based on a government, a seat of power, or a geographic political boundary. So the issue in the news is our exit from Afghanistan. It's extraordinarily painful to watch that. It's particularly painful to watch that given the death of American soldiers there. And there's a lot of hand wringing. There's a lot of flip-flopping as well for people who first argued we need to get out of Afghanistan as quickly as possible. But then when there is the exit from Afghanistan, oh, this is done poorly, or we're leaving people behind, or we shouldn't be exiting, or I'm not quite sure what. But no matter what your political point of view is, the US exit from Afghanistan is painful, and it's disturbing, and it's upsetting, and especially when we look at the loss of life. What is my point with this, and what does it relate to the Constitution? Number one, 20 years ago when we entered Afghanistan, this was the outcome. It was preordained. There's no way to go in. Could US military forces create a democracy? And the answer is no. That's impossible for that to have happened. We knew that 20 years ago. We knew that 100 years ago. But despite that, our leaders did not study this lesson from history. As this relates to the US Constitution, the Constitution is more than a piece of paper. It is a conceptual idea. It's in the fiber of our being. We have to have a belief in the system of government. That doesn't exist here. So we're not going to be able to export democracy. You just cannot add water and create democracy. It has to be a viewpoint held by the people. One more story. Here's a great book I just read. This is on John Kennedy. It traces his life. The author is a Harvard professor who won the Pulitzer Prize, not for this book, but for a different book. And it traces John Kennedy from his birth up until he's sitting with his father and they decide to run for US presidency. Fascinating story. And the Kennedys were one of the wealthiest families. They made money in banking, in stock speculation, and then Joe Kennedy went on to regulate the stock market after he learned how to trick it. He went to Hollywood and made movies, and he also may have done some rum running. So a very, very wealthy family, and but was a Democratic family. Franklin Roosevelt took his money and liked having a business leader who endorsed a Democrat, but Joe Kennedy was a real pain, so didn't know what to do with him. So he sent him to England as the ambassador to England. And at this point, John Kennedy is in his senior year of Harvard, and he has to do a senior thesis at Harvard. So imagine if you're a student and you've got to do a paper for Penn State. He got to travel through Europe right at the time when everybody was fleeing and exiting. And he'd go not only to the embassy in England, but he'd go to the embassy in Paris, or he'd go to Belgium. And the ambassador was there and said, well, all the staff is home. Hey, young kid, come with me. He had entree to not only the top US diplomats, but their foreign counterparts, the foreign ministers, royalty, society, business and finance leaders. And he did all of this for all of his womanizing and all of his playboy lifestyle and his devil-may-care attitude, and all of that's true. He also was a legitimate historian who loved history. And he really did his work, and he interviewed that. And he wrote this book. His senior thesis was called Why England Slept. It was a play on words off of another book by a Briton called Why While England Slept. So the first book was this appeasement occurred, but the second book explained what was going on with the mentality of how the British people could appease that. But John Kennedy was kind of this Svengoolie figure who was everywhere and anywhere, and he got to travel all throughout Europe at the highest levels as a college student and did a paper. And then his father had a lot of money, so he turned it into a best-selling book. Can you imagine that? John Kennedy was in an all-male dorm, but he needed secretaries and a stenographic pool to type up his papers and his notes. So there's all this this whole line of beautiful young women outside the door who wanted to become. So can you imagine, you know, as F. Scott Fitzgerald said, the rich are not like you and me. So I did not have a pool of stenographs able to type my college papers, but that was John Kennedy. Why am I going on about that? He got to see Germany and this appeasement, but he also got to see the propaganda machine of the Nazis. And what led into the invasion of Poland and Czechoslovakia, and these were the tipping points that led to war, was this propaganda-driven machine that the Germans were liberators, that there were these atrocities committed against the German people by the Poles and by the Czechs, that they had to go there in a very patriotic fervor to save these people against these terrible atrocities. None of that was true. But what did you have? You did not have filters of media to figure out what's true and what's not true. You had a government propaganda machine that could promote this kind of falsehood. Number two is you had a generally uneducated public and people who really couldn't discern the information coming at them and knowing what's true and what's not true. And then finally, you had people with a gigantic chip on their shoulder, a giant resentment. If you want to understand the origins of World War II, you have to look at World War I. World War II is pretty much a continuation of World War I. So there's great economic depression. All of that is a recipe for a mob mentality to take extreme action. Does any of that connect to America and the presidential election and the disassociation? What's the lesson? As W.C. Fields said, there's a fool born every minute and two to take them across. The danger of how do demagogues come into power? There's got to be an uneducated public. There's got to be people who are susceptible to this. I'm going to go in very rapid fashion. This is, for the last couple of years, this is the story of the Constitution, but there's quite a bit to unpack here, and I'm going to go super fast to do that. But we get very passionate about the Constitution. We argue about the Constitution. Some people carry around a copy of the Constitution. But I say, what is the Constitution? What does this mean? And that becomes a little bit more difficult to understand. Sandra Day O'Connor is still with us. She explains that every generation has to learn this lesson. We have to learn the basic nuts and bolts of what our country is and how it came about. And this story that I'm about to tell you, the Constitution, it's not a fixed point. It's changing. It's something that every generation has to learn this lesson. So, what is the Constitution? What is the rule of law? What do these concepts mean? Here's the Constitution, and other than if you can't probably read the fine print on your computer screen at home, but we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, do. So it's a great opening sentence, but then the rest of this document is pretty darn boring. You have Article 1, which says that there's going to be a Congress and a legislature, and they have the power to pass laws and to adopt taxes. Article 2 says we're going to have an executive branch of government, and there's an office called the presidency. Article 3 is kind of a little tiny afterthought. We're going to have a court system. But that document in and of itself is a very boring thing. There's got to be more to this story. Well, there is much more to this story. Here's the famous picture. Didn't quite look like this, but you have some of the characters, if you can see where I'm pointing. Here's George Washington presiding over the Constitutional Convention. There's Alexander Hamilton whispering in to Benjamin Franklin's ear. You have John Adams. So you have the first president of the United States, you have the second president, the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, is off in Paris. But here you have the fourth president of the United States and the hero of our story, the unsung hero, our tiniest little president, James Madison. James Madison doesn't get a lot of props, but he is the father of the US Constitution and of the Bill of Rights. The Constitution has something to do with these people. This is the Supreme Court, and what is such a radical shift that's going on. Here's a picture of a court of just a couple of years ago of Antonin Scalia, who's passed away, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's passed away, and Anthony Kennedy, who's retired from the court. That gave Donald Trump 3 appointments in a very short period of time. And you have at the top here, Brett Kavanaugh, Neil Gorsuch, and Amy Coney Barrett are the 3 new Republican Trump appointees. So the balance of power on the court has shifted dramatically in a very short period of time. And you see in the news that there are some very dramatic decisions that are being teed up. The most controversial one is regarding abortion and whether or not the laws regarding abortion are about to change based on the Supreme Court. Let me see if I can tie that together. not only are we the great melting pot of people, that we are immigrants coming from the shore and we take the best of people from all over the world, but our Constitution and our concept of democracy is also this melting pot of conceptual ideas. And it really has a history of 2,500 years of Western civilization, all distilled into our system of government. The founding fathers were trained in the classics, so the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, and some of these ideas from Socrates or from Aristotle or from Marcus Aurelius. These are some of the thoughts that were rattling around in the brain of the founding fathers. Here's a chart that shows the Black Plague, the bubonic plague that swept over and over again throughout Europe. Prior to this, people were very cloistered. They lived in little rural agricultural villages. They hardly traveled. And the plague in some places could wipe out as much as 50, 60, 70% of the population, just decimated. So the people who survived after this, there was this great explosion. People were just joyous and happy to be alive. And it created, after the plague, an incredible change we call the Renaissance. This is the birth of Venus in Florence. Very different. Look at the colors. Look at the imagery. Not that old, staid, boring, very dark pictures. But here you got a naked woman with bright colors. You know, this is very new, very radical. A birth of industry, of commerce, an explosion of travel and business throughout the world. The Reformation, the Catholic Church, the Christian church there was one single Christian church, and that was the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church was more than just a religion. It was really a system of government. So in the different towns throughout Europe, you not only had the church as a religious body, but it was really the kind of the governing way that the government was organized as well. So you started to have people who protested this, Protestants or Protestants. And here's Martin Luther and his concept of that. It begins this idea of greater individuality, what we call humanism, the idea that each of us has worth. Here is Henry VIII. I've told this story in the lecture before. Henry wasn't all bad. People think he chopped off the wives of all of his head's wives. He only chopped off the head of 2 wives. So let's cut Henry a break. But Henry wanted a male heir. He was never able to produce a living male heir to become the king. But he tried, and he tried with lots of different women. And with his first wife, who was actually his brother's wife, but his brother died when these 2 were teenagers, but then he married his brother's wife. And they had a daughter, but they never had a son. And he wanted to find a younger, prettier thing. And he wanted to annul his marriage, but the Pope would not allow him to do that. So he said, you know what, he before that was a very fervent Catholic and doing everything with the Catholic Church. But he said, I'm going to start my own religious thing. It's going to be called the Church of England. And guess what? We don't really need a Pope in Rome. I think I'm going to make myself my own Pope. I'm going to make the king. And to this day, if any of you watched The Crown on Netflix, the Queen of England is still the head of the Church of England. Some things they don't change a whole lot, but you had this great religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics, and that war raged throughout Europe. That war raged right when the shores came. There's all kinds of great philosophical writings and thinkers, but this new age of enlightenment, the new movement of humanism in the 1400s, the 1500s, the 1600s, and 1700s, this new way of thinking. William Shakespeare, in his writing, this sums up this new attitude. We control our own fate. What we do controls things. These ideas all bubbled up, and we brought them to the shores of America. Here are the Pilgrims. It didn't quite look like that, but that's a nice image. And in a fairly short period of time, our relationship with England became strained. There were still fights between France and England as to these new colonies. These colonies were seen as a way of producing money, bringing back to Europe. The people here weren't really thrilled with that idea. But preceding the American Revolution was the French and Indian War. After that, England said, hey, we had to spend a lot of money to win this war. We want to get repaid, so we're going to institute some taxes to pay for that. The American colonists didn't like that idea so much. Here's a picture of the Boston Massacre. It did not look like this. This is a piece of propaganda. This engraving was done by a guy named Paul Revere, and this was sent out almost immediately. It didn't look like that. In fact, John Adams defended the captain of the guard of the British soldiers that they acted in self-defense, and he won their acquittal. That's Benjamin Franklin's Join or Die. We see that right now in 2021, and the people who came to Washington to overthrow the government use that some of these same imagery. Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. The Revolutionary War went on for a long time. We finally won in the victory of Yorktown for a lot of different reasons. So at the aftermath of the American Revolution, we had quite a dilemma. On one hand, we just fought a war to get rid of England. We want independence, we want freedom, and we don't want anybody to tell us what to do. That's what this war was all about. On the flip side of that, we need to have some kind of system. You need to have some kind of centralized control. You need to have some kind of force and authority. You need to have some kind of military. You need to have some kind of police force. We need to maintain security. You need to have some taxes. All of us hate taxes. Nobody likes any taxes, but people sure like the things that taxes pay for. So how do you pay for things? How do you pay for streets and roads and schools and airports and trains and all these things that taxes pay for, but nobody pays taxes? So these are the conundrum, and we had a very weak system of government. I like this quote from Thomas Jefferson. I never considered a difference of opinion in politics and religion and philosophy as a cause for withdrawing from a friend. What about now in 2021? Do people view that as a cause for withdrawing from a friend? Another founder, John Adams, the second president of the United States. Thomas Jefferson was the pen of the American Revolution in writing the Declaration of Independence, a universal declaration for the whole world of human rights. John Adams was the voice of the American Revolution and forcefully argued for this. Benjamin Franklin, we have a couple of other quotes here. It's always good for some funny lines. Alexander Hamilton got killed in a duel with Aaron Burr, but was one of the chief architects, was the chief lieutenant to George Washington, but his concept of what the business system, what the banking system, our taxation system, our mercantile system, really our republic is much more a republic based on the ideas of Alexander Hamilton than Thomas Jefferson. But he and James Madison were very much teamed up that advocating we need to have a stronger form of government. Here's the hero of our story, James Madison. James Madison kind of had an advanced degree in understanding why governments succeed or why they fail. If men were angels, no government would be necessary, but of course, men and women are not angels. The battle came between people like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, who said, we need this new, strong, powerful Constitution. And people like Patrick Henry, who just a couple slides ago said, give me liberty or give me death, who said, wait a second, we need something that restrains the government, not empowers it. We need a break on the government. James Madison said, look, we can't change this document, but I'll tell you what I'll do. I don't really think that this restraint on government is really necessary. But just to make you happy, I promise the first thing we'll do after this is adopted is the new Congress, we will amend this Constitution and we'll put in some of this flowery language. And he was good to his word, and the Constitution was adopted. Delaware is called the first state because it was the first state. Pennsylvania was the second state. But when you had a majority of the states adopt this, this became the new law of the land. And James Madison not only wrote this Constitution, but he was good to his word, and he amended the Constitution. And they adopted these amendments. The first 10 amendments are the Bill of Rights. These define the essential liberties that we possess. And they also set forth certain restrictions on what the government can do. So all the Supreme Court, we said the Supreme Court gets to interpret what is constitutional, what's not constitutional. It's not that boring bylaws section of the Constitution. It's not Article 1 and Article 2 that these cases hinge on. It's on this language. It's from the Bill of Rights, this thing that was an afterthought. This is what we argue about in court. And this is what the Supreme Court, every question that goes to the Supreme Court, they have to answer, is something constitutional or is it not constitutional? Is it basically, in our view as a people, is it fair or is it unfair? And they're interpreting these words. We don't like government, and we don't like any one person to have any too much power. So it's very difficult to get anything done in government. There's lots of checks and balances. I think Donald Trump found out, I don't think Donald Trump knew a whole lot about government and how it works, but when he was president, he found it was very difficult to get anything done. The reason is there's tremendous restraints on power to get anything done. So again, there's the Supreme Court, there's the old Supreme Court in a very short period of time, a radical change to the Supreme Court, but it's these 9 people, they get to interpret the Constitution, they get to say what the rule of law is, they get to say what is fair, what is unfair, what is constitutional, what is not constitutional. I'd like to wrap up and look at 4 ways very quickly that the US Constitution plays a role in saving our democracy. James Madison, again, was the chief architect, and what he did is he studied governments and how governments fail. And why do governments eventually collapse? And so the Constitution is written as a way to create an enduring legacy that it won't fail. And so there are safeguards that are actually written into the Constitution that help do that. The first one is the freedom of speech. If we can speak freely without government coercion, I gave you the example earlier as to how history teaches us lessons of Nazi Germany and the propaganda machine of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels, and what ultimately led to the Holocaust and that death and destruction. It starts with not having free speech. We have very pointed views. We have very different views, but we have the right to express our views. I drive around, I see signs in different neighborhoods around Berks County and beyond that are disgusting, I have a younger child and I don't want my child to see that. And I hate the message, but I also say, as a constitutional attorney, I understand that the person has a right to do it. But boy, is it tough to stomach? Is it tough to see that? This is a great quote, which is a beautiful sentiment, but boy, is it difficult to put into practice. I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say that. I think all of us, the better angels of our nature, would like to say that. But when you come across somebody who says something different, it's difficult to do that. That's a pretty ominous quote from George Washington about how we'll be led to slaughter without the protection of free speech. A free press is very similar, but you need to have independent newspapers that are not driven by our government, that they have the ability to discern what is true and what's not. Again, that example that I gave you, and John Kennedy, and going and looking at how did Germany come to invade Poland and Czechoslovakia? The people thought that they were righteous warriors. I like this little cartoon. Democracy's most important documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the newspaper. That's very, very true. Walter Cronkite, freedom of the press is not just important to democracy, it is democracy itself. The only security for all is a free press. So having that kind of press, that's our protection number 2. Religion. James Madison understood that religious conflict leads to destruction. My example of Afghanistan was not only that the understanding of democracy, that it has to be in our DNA, that people have to understand and believe this. It has to be a value system. It doesn't matter. You could have beautiful words written on a piece of paper, but unless people buy in and they understand it, it doesn't have a whole lot of meaning. The First Amendment has 2 parts to this. The first part's real easy and isn't usually too controversial. We all get to be whatever religion. If I want to be Catholic, if I want to be Lutheran, if I want to be Presbyterian, if I want to be Muslim, if I want to be a Sikh, if I want to be Jewish, if I want to run naked through the woods, nobody wants to see that, but if that's my religion, I can do that. So that's usually not too controversial. Here's where it gets controversial. There shall be no official state religion. And that's where these cases, this is where the rubber hits the road, where despite saying we have a separation of church and state, it's people of a certain religious viewpoint who want to insert a religious ideology. It's not just Afghanistan. These issues are front and center. This whole abortion debate going before the Supreme Court, it's a religious viewpoint that's coming into a legal conflict. I think the country is strengthened by our diversity of different people, different cultures, and different religions. But can you tolerate someone else's religion? Finally, I think this is the most important one, especially on a college campus, is the freedom to think and the power of education. The freedom to think freely is an absolutely critical thing for making our democracy work. Our democracy does not work without free thought. And education is the key to that. John Adams, let us dare to read, think, speak, and write. I like this quote from Nelson Mandela: education is the most powerful weapon we can use to change the world. Albert Einstein, education is not the learning of facts, but the training of the mind to think. George Washington Carver, education is the key to unlock the golden door of freedom. This is not just idealistic talk on my behalf. I'm trying to explain how our government works, what the Constitution is, how it functions, and it can only work with an educated populace. There's a famous, during the presidential election of Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson. Adlai Stevenson was a very good person, but never was a very dramatic campaigner, and got his clock cleaned twice by Eisenhower. Eisenhower was incredibly popular, but at a train whistle stop, a man from the crowd said, he said, "The thinking man is with you, candidate Stevenson." And Stevenson was pretty smart. He called back, he said, "That's not good enough. I need a majority." So, we're coming down to the end, and I want to make sure that I can read that quote that you couldn't hear with our technical difficulties. The clearest way to show what the rule of law means to us in everyday life is to recall what has happened when there is no rule of law. Here's, I think, my favorite quote of all the different quotes, and we talk about the founding fathers, but why not have a Native American also as a founding father? This is Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce Indians, who fought and fought and fought and finally stopped fighting and said, I will make war no more. This quote, take a second to please read this. I'm going to read it out to you because I think this quote alone sums up everything that I'm trying to talk about right now. Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to talk, think, and act for myself. And with that, I will obey every law and submit to the penalty. Our Constitution and the Bill of Rights is a contract with the government between its people. We agree to be loyal citizens of the United States, to act within the rule of law, but within that, there are certain rights that are enshrined. They're enshrined in the Bill of Rights. I think Chief Joseph very eloquently states exactly that whole message. I told you Benjamin Franklin's always good. He says, the US Constitution doesn't guarantee happiness, only the pursuit of it. You have to catch up with it yourself. So my favorite Benjamin Franklin quote is, the institution of marriage, go into it with your eyes wide open and the rest of it with your eyes half shut. So that's, my wife doesn't like that, but I think that's fun. John Adams talking about the Declaration of Independence. Let it be celebrated with pomp and circumstance. So that's why we have fireworks every 4th of July. And sort of my patriotism is coming back despite all of the gloom and doom. It is Constitution Day. I still believe in the power of our country. I believe the Constitution is designed to survive, but our democracy is under threat. And that threat is beaten back by smart, young, intelligent people who can read, who can think, who can question. I'm not advocating a point of view. I don't care if you're liberal or conservative, if you're a Democrat or Republican, if you're pro-Trump or anti-Trump. But what I do care very deeply about is that you go through a liberal arts education, that you open your mind, you be willing to engage in new thoughts and new thinking and dialogue and communicate with someone else. That is how our democracy is designed to function. And if we blindly go down the path and we're easily fooled, I gave you that quote from W.C. Fields, that's dangerous territory. I'm scared about the attacks on our country, but we can stop those attacks through education. Okay. Sure. We have. Okay, great. So I'm sorry we had a technical difficulty. Let me read this story. It's very short, and then we'll kind of open up for both discussion and some questions in the little bit of time that we have left. The donkey told the tiger, the grass is blue. The tiger replied, no, the grass is green. The discussion became heated and the two decided to submit the issue to arbitration. So they approached the lion. As they approached the lion on his throne, the donkey started screaming, Your Highness, isn't it true that the grass is blue? The lion replied, if you believe it is true, the grass is blue. The donkey rushed forward and continued, the tiger disagrees with me, contradicts me, annoys me. Please punish him. The king declared, the tiger will be punished with 3 days of silence. The donkey jumped with joy and went on his way, content and repeating, the grass is blue, the grass is blue, the grass is blue. The tiger asked the lion, Your Majesty, why have you punished me? After all, the grass is green. The lion replied, you've known and seen the grass is green. The tiger asked, so why do you punish me? The lion replied, that has nothing to do with the question of whether the grass is blue or green. The punishment is because it is degrading for the brave, intelligent creature like you to waste time arguing with an ass. And on top of that, you came and bothered me with that question just to validate something that you already knew was true. The biggest waste of time is arguing with a fool and fanatic who doesn't care about truth or reality, but only the victory of his beliefs and illusions. Never waste time on discussions that make no sense. There are people who, for all the evidence presented to them, do not have the ability to understand. Others who are blinded by ego, hatred, and resentment, and the only thing that they want is to be right, even if they are not. When ignorance screams, intelligence moves on. So,
Love that. I'm so glad that we were able to put that in there again. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
great.
Scott Hoh is our speaker for Constitution Day tonight, and the title of his talk is a question that was answered or asked earlier: can the U.S. Constitution save American democracy for Constitution Day 2021? And the name was Scott Hoh, and he is an attorney in the Reading area. And I am happy to facilitate some questions. If anybody would like to ask any questions right now, we have a minute or two. And I'll give it a second for that to folks to populate some questions. Scott, can I just ask you a question?
Sure, please.
About the origin of your passion for the Constitution. What was that?
Sure.
That like sort of germinated in you?
Well, it's kind of both. I teach part-time and I would teach this. And, you know, when you start out as a young teacher, you're not so good. And then you get better and better. And after you tell the same thing, after 20 years, you start to get kind of good at it. So that was part of the evolution. Part of it is I'm an attorney, and this is also the legal realm. And part of the reason why I wanted to become an attorney is I saw that these great political questions of the day became legal fights. But I also love history. If I could go back again, I think I'd want to be a history major and not have been a political science major or other types of things. So what I see is there's a lot of great constitutional scholars who are a lot smarter than I am. There's certainly a number of historians who are smarter than I am. But what I try to do is transport in time and go back and tell the story of the American Revolution and the origins of our Constitution and explain what that means with the modern day Supreme Court and our politics. And I don't think there's too many people who are transporting back and forth the way that I do. So I'm trying to digest all of that and tell this story.
That's really interesting to me. And I know last year the focus of your talk was really, was the right before the election of 2020, and you were preparing for just different concerns from the election. And I just remember that as being a focus and trying to weave the Constitution into that. So not from a political perspective, but from a constitutional perspective as a constitutional lawyer, tell me what your experience was from the beginning of November through the end of January, and how did that sit with you with all of those concerns?
Well, you know, we've been in a weird place, haven't we? And COVID has really thrown all of us for a loop. And we've all kind of been in this twilight zone of an existence really for what, a year and a half or so. It's been a very strange time. And then on top of that, you had this presidential election and the polarization. And I really, maybe it was naive, I really thought, okay, there's an election and that was going to be a catharsis. And it was a time of healing, and both we're getting a cure for COVID and inoculations at the same time that there's a change, whether you're pro-Biden or anti-Biden or pro-Trump, at least there's going to be some normalcy in the White House of getting back to some of the norms and not some of the outrageous things. So my expectation was really, hey, the light at the end of the tunnel is there. Instead, I feel we had this riot attempt, and whether you think I was a small group or a big group, but we're so split apart as a country. We're so split apart. And then further, now we have COVID coming back with different variants and people who don't want to get shots and they don't want to wear masks. So that's where my discouragement comes from. I'm pretty darn frustrated that we haven't advanced the ball more.
Yeah, and I think that as well. Well, I want to say thank you again for being with us here tonight at Penn State Parks and being part of our yearly celebration of Constitution Day. I am very grateful to you for answering my phone call every year when I call. And I look forward to next year and invite you to join us again and to see what your spin will be next year about
Great.
how to facilitate the Constitution into our modern day world. So
Great.
thank you.
You're
Thank you
quite
for
welcome.
being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. This has been Penn State Works LionSide Chat.